evening. My name is Donald Ross, and on behalf of my colleagues, the board members of the Salisbury Forum Board of Directors, I want to welcome you to the program tonight, which is the first program of this season, and this season is the 2017-18 season. There'll be 7 more programs coming before June of next year. We appreciate the support of all of you who are here tonight. By your attendance, it's really a boost. And as you know, all forum programs, both the talks and the movies, are free of charge. We're able to do this because of the donations of the 2 schools, the Hotchkiss School and Salisbury School, and together they contribute about 20% of the total cost of running the programs for a year. The rest of the money, the 80%, are raised by donors like those people, those of you sitting in this audience, who appreciate the opportunity to hear the kinds of speakers that you're going to hear tonight. Last year, we had 225 donors contribute, and that made up the difference between breaking even, losing money, or making money. Last year, we broke even, which is good. For more than a decade, the Salisbury Forum has dedicated in each of its seasons the first program to the founder of the Salisbury Forum, Frank Duchambeau. Frank and his partner, Mark Spohr, are here tonight, and I would ask you to give a round of applause, and Frank, please stand. Frank founded the forum, but he is still very much involved in helping us. As usual, after the conclusion of the speaker's talk, there will be board members with microphones going up and down the aisle so that there'll be time for asking questions. Please make them questions and no comments, because the time is going to be short for the question and answer period, and we want to make the most use of it. At the conclusion of the question period, Steve has agreed to sign books for a while. We want to thank Oblong Books for assembling a supply of his works that he will sign as many as he can before he has to leave to make an early morning appointment down in Philadelphia tomorrow. Steve, people have seen the ad in the Lakeville, or the articles by Leon Graham in the Lakeville Journal a week ago, and the advertisement perhaps this week. He is the Dean of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and has spent extensive time reporting both internationally and domestically. Steve Coll.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming out. It's a beautiful evening. And I'm really glad to be here. I hope this will be lively. I'm pretty sure it will be. I do feel the title is a little bit of clickbait, and I'm not sure that will this does feel like the age of Trump in the sense that it feels like it's been going on for 7 or 8 years, but it has actually only been 8 months. And so what I want to do with my time is a few things. I want to try to put this period of polarization and controversy about the press, excitement about the press, renewed interest in the press, into a wider context, give you a little bit of a potted history of how we got to this point from my perspective, having grown up in the business in an era before, in newspaper newsroom for 20 years at the Washington Post, ultimately managing editor there, before the internet really disrupted the structure of the news business. And I think I'm going to try to put some of what you no doubt live and see and that may frustrate you about cable news polarization and pressures on newsrooms into a kind of historical context. So that's one thing I want to do. I want to talk about the media's performance in the 2016 election. How many of you thought we did a great job? Come on, somebody. Okay, some students, yeah. And, okay, so we'll talk about that. And let me just get a read of the room. How many of you read the New York Times every day? How many of you prefer MSNBC to Fox News? Okay, got it. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the very serious threats to the press under the constitutional system that we are so privileged to have inherited, and why those threats go beyond being yelled at or tweeted at, and really do constitute a test for all of us, for our constitutional system, and for us in the press to stand up and defend the rights and values that I want to say are more fragile and younger than most people appreciate. So that's what I'm going to do with my time. I want to start my sort of contextualization with a story about the man who created the world that I live in now, Joseph Pulitzer. So I am the steward of a school that he created more than 100 years ago, at the same time that he endowed the Pulitzer Prizes, which are, we're their landlord, but they're an independent body with a board of journalists. So you probably don't know the story of Joseph Pulitzer, but it's worth knowing because it reflects in one man's life a really important transition in the character of journalism in the United States between the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So Pulitzer was born in Hungary, I think it was in the 1840s. A middle-class family, got a good education, but his family had really bad luck. All of his brothers died, his parents died. And as he came of age, he answered an ad in a Hungarian newspaper that was placed by families in Hudson Valley, New York, looking for mercenaries to substitute for their sons after Lincoln imposed the draft in the United States Civil War. One way that he got through the resistance to the draft was to allow you to substitute someone. And so people with wealth started advertising in Europe for young men who were willing to come over. So Pulitzer comes over. He speaks only German. He's mustered into a horseback unit, a cavalry unit, of only German speakers.
Wow.
He enters into the Civil War. They ride up and down the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, 1864, 1865. They don't see a lot of action. The war ends. They're released. Welcome to America. Still basically only speaks German. So he goes out to St. Louis because he knows there's a very large German-speaking community there, and he arrives to this frontier town where newspapers are embedded in competitive party politics. Newspapers essentially are communications arms of fiercely polarized political parties. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, you can imagine there were some hard feelings, especially in border states like Missouri. And he became part of the Democratic Party, then Democratic Party's resistance to the triumphalism of the Republican Party. And he started publishing newspapers and editing newspapers, gradually into English. And he became an investigative reporter. Now, an investigative reporter in those days essentially had one mission, which was to dig up revealing dirt about whoever was running against your party. And that's what he did. But they were stories about corruption, graft, poor governance. So one day he published one of these stories about a political rival across St. Louis, and the man objected to it, came to Pulitzer's office, got into a fierce argument with him. Pulitzer pulled out a pistol and shot him in the leg. So this is Joseph Pulitzer, okay? Pulitzer Prizes. This being St. Louis in like 1872 or so, the punishment that he faced was a fine. And he did leave town. He went to New York. He started the New York World, made a fortune as an innovator in newspapers, a popular newspaper, really targeted to the newly arriving immigrant communities in New York, innovated with the first use of color illustrations and cartoons, and made a great success. And at the end of his life, he suffered from terrible ill health, blindness, and various forms of nerve pain. And he became highly reflective, and it was in this period that he started to conceive of a change in journalism, really a change from the kind he had practiced, the kind that he had overseen in many ways, but that he thought would strengthen democracy and reduce corruption and hold politicians accountable. And he actually talked about the next 75 years. This was around 1904. And he wrote this seminal essay in the North American Review that imagined journalism becoming a profession comparable to law, comparable to accounting, medicine, one that would have ethics, independence, a code of self-policing, and which would pursue some version of the scientific method to inform the public, to make them better citizens, to support better outcomes at election time. And he wrote this all down, and really you can go back and read this piece. I do it once or twice a year just to remind myself about it, because it is so prescient. There weren't that many people at that time in the 20th century who would have had models to look at. So the world that Sandy and Kate and myself grew up in as journalists of a certain generation was really shaped by this vision, and then it was reinforced by economic history. As the 20th century went along, you had examples more and more where the business model that was succeeding in journalism was tied to fact-based reporting, a neutral tone that did not take sides. It started with the wire services who were serving these very partisan papers, and they couldn't afford to deliver news in a way that would offend either of their polarized client bases, but both of their polarized client bases wanted to know what the score was, who won the game, when the ships came in, and other news that could be delivered in a reliable way to all clients. And so as journalism evolved, as particularly after the Second World War, and newspaper towns went from 15 newspaper towns to 6 newspaper towns, to 2 newspaper towns, to 1 newspaper towns, and as television, network television became increasingly influential in the news diets of Americans, the profession grew up in an environment where there were lots of incentives to try to make your journalism transparent, reliable, and credible to very diverse audiences, whether in a metropolitan area or watching a television network. So in the case of the Washington Post, by the time I joined there in 1985, the Evening Star had gone away because people were watching the network news, and there was only one newspaper left in town. And the whole business model of the Washington Post was to be an essential part of every home's breakfast table in the Washington area. Firemen and public school teachers and Pentagon generals and their staff sergeants and CIA officers and Redskins fans and everybody. And the newsroom's ethos of being credible and transparent to this very large and diverse metropolitan area was inseparable from the goals of the owners of the paper to reach as many people, to be welcomed in as many homes as possible. Now that was and it was a very difficult business for anyone to compete with, because if you wanted to start a newspaper in Washington, D.C., you had to buy a very expensive press and buy trucks and newsprint and ink. And so the Post thrived in that Watergate era, in the era that followed it, Pentagon Papers era. It had a highly ambitious professional newsroom that inculcated these values, that had grown up in the profession, that were policed within the profession, that were discussed by top editors at annual conferences, that were reviewed when mistakes blew up. There were big projects of accountability journalism about the failure of the journalism. when the Janet Cook thing happened, the Post commissioned an internal investigation, published the damning results on the front page on a Sunday. There was a sense that this is what the vision of a professional newsroom should be. And on the television side, you had the major networks carrying out their roles in exchange for a license. And the news divisions were, sort of loss leaders for what were basically entertainment companies. But there was still a sense that under the fairness doctrine and under FCC regulation, they had better watch themselves and make themselves credible and responsible, even with only 30 minutes to reach the public. And this was the era of Walter Cronkite, of course, and the sense that he spoke for something independent, part of the public square, something credible. So we don't live in that world anymore, and it's vanished very quickly. And I don't think that as news consumers, as citizens, we spend a lot of time reflecting on exactly what has happened and why and what the results are. But it has really been a very rapid transformation. So the World Wide Web broke out in the late 90s, and then it started to disrupt the business models of newspapers within 4 or 5 years, and then severely by the time we get to 2006, 2007, and then the Great Recession. You have this rapid collapse of the economic independence of the newspaper industry. And meantime, of course, the characteristic of the digital revolution is that it collapses the barriers to entry. Everyone can be a publisher now. You don't need to buy those expensive printing presses and all the ink in the trucks. And so everyone does become a publisher. And you have this massive stretching of entry into journalism, news, media, across all kinds of platforms. And this is before the social media platforms rise and then start to change the distribution of news. Just reflect on this. This has happened in just 10 years. Very rapid change. Now, the reason it matters to us thinking about polarization and the character of the news organizations that we confront today is it changed the incentives in newsrooms in a profound way. So, in order to build a sustainable news business in this chaotic, wide open, no barriers to entry environment, you need a fully engaged audience. You need an audience that really is committed to your vibe, to your newsroom, to your channel. Let's talk about it briefly in the case of both newspaper-based news organizations and cable television. Some of you probably work in the TV business or you know how cable stations make their money. Do you realize how profitable Fox News is, and for that matter, CNN and MSNBC? Huge margins. I think in Fox's case, something like 60% profitability. Only Apple in the world operates at that scale of profitability. Why is it? Because every morning when Fox News gets up, the subscriber fee that you pay for your cable package, and see, we all pay for our cable packages, the young people here, none of them do. But you're still paying for yours. That, $200, $230 a month you write as a check, a few pennies of that, or a penny or half a penny, goes to Fox News, and they are profitable before they sell a single ad because of that cable subscription revenue. And so, for that matter, is MSNBC and CNN. And when they think about the existential threats to their business, what they want is to be the last station that a cable company would ever throw off of their system, and an organization with a passionate, devoted, committed audience that can survive the transition to digital news. So their incentive is to build tribes. The same thing is true around newspaper communities, where you have the New York Times having navigated this very successful transition from heavy dependency on advertising to more than 50% of its revenue now coming from subscriptions. You guys all read the New York Times, you pay for the New York Times, and you pay a lot for the New York Times because it's that valuable. And they have been able to build this community of subscribers at fairly high prices, but it has to be a community. it's no longer the kind of newsroom that the Associated Press built, to serve all of its diverse clients. It has to be some kind of a community. Now, that community can be built around professional journalistic values, transparency, completeness, fairness. Objectivity is not a very useful word in this discussion because it implies something that's not human. We all have our perspectives, our origins, our biases. We all have the same brains that for some reason seek out information that pleases us, that confirms beliefs we already hold. I sometimes joke with friends in the journalism business, well, how could we be the dominant species on Earth with this big flaw in our brain called confirmation bias that always seeks out pleasing information, prefers to hear things that we already agree with? And because it seems like we should have failed with something but the smarter friends of mine, at least the ones in evolutionary biology, say, no, it's all about solidarity. You've got to hang together, and you've got to hang together even when you're not really sure why you're doing it. And so, anyway, there is a form of professional journalism, I strongly believe, that is derived from the scientific method, that battles against confirmation bias, that encourages reporters to report against their own assumptions, that measures the outcome of a piece of journalism on grounds, let's not call it objectivity, but is it fair? Is it complete? Is it contextualized? Is it rigorous? Does it leave out misleadingly information that a complete story would have in it? This is still the core of professional journalism, and it's so vital to us in our field because, among other things, it's the basis on which we claim our fragile rights before the courts in our constitutional system. Why do courts occasionally, on the basis of First Amendment jurisprudence, recognize journalists as a protected group who might have an interest in protecting the identity of confidential sources, that might have an interest in being notified about a subpoena before it's served so that they can argue against its necessity? Why do state laws, 46 out of 50 states, pass versions of the Shield Law, which provide qualified privileges to journalists to protect confidential sources, to avoid testifying in criminal matters unless it's absolutely essential, and so on? Why have these rights arrived? It's because of the recognition in the courts, in society, among news readers, that journalism at its best does have these characteristics. It is independent, it is fact-driven, it is truth-seeking, and it relies on a kind of methodology of research that is recognizable. Neither science, nor medicine, nor journalism, nor accountancy, nor law are flawless for having these aspirations by any means, and they fail regularly. But to lose confidence in the centrality of these values will be to surrender the rights and the place of journalism in our constitutional system and the way it's evolved, even way beyond the brilliant visioning of the founding fathers. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I think the kind of Fox News, MSNBC sort of story is so interesting, because it is a symptom of structural change. And some of that structural change is located in the business history I just described. Some of it's located in us. There's a great book that I recommend if you haven't come across it. It's a decade old now, but it's still remarkably insightful. It's called The Big Sort. It's written by a journalist down in Texas and a political demographer. And it describes how, for reasons that are very interesting to consider, Americans have gradually sorted themselves into like-minded communities over the last 40 years, from about the mid-1970s until the present tense. One way to measure this is the number of counties in the United States where, at presidential election time, there is a landslide, meaning one candidate wins by more than 20% of the vote over the other. The number of landslide counties in the United States has more than doubled over the last 30 or 40 years. And the authors have a hypothesis that some of this is about economic mobility, that when those who have the opportunities to move to work tend to move and live in like-minded communities. But some of it is cultural too. We have become polarized around identity, around faith, around around race, of course, as ever. And so you have social forces and political forces connecting with big structural, technological, and business forces, and so no wonder you end up with these pressures. Now, if I had a web connection, I'd pop up a really interesting piece of research that I urge you to look up in the Columbia Journalism Review. It was produced by 4 professors, one of whose name is Ethan Zuckerman, another Yochai Benkler. You can remember those names. It's worth looking at. They did a huge analysis of the Twitter reading habits and digital reading habits of Americans during the 2016 election. And I won't go through all their methodology, but they ended up creating a visualization of just how polarized American perceptions of the media are. So which news outlets are seen as left, and how far left are they seen? Which news outlets are seen as right, and how far right are they seen? And which ones are seen as fairly neutral? And they actually used colors, sort of blue, and then red, and then green for the ones in the middle. And two things that you might find interesting. One is, their finding, anyway, was that this polarization of the bubbles, sort of a light blue Washington Post bubble, pretty close to neutral, a slightly darker blue New York Times bubble moving a little further to the left, a few green bubbles in the middle, The Hill, Politico, USA Today, and then on the right, a huge gap until you get much further out on the right than the Times and the Post place, Breitbart, Fox News. And what they wanted us to understand is that this polarization is asymmetric. It's much more pronounced on the right than it is on the left. But there was another element of the study that was so fascinating. They looked at the behavior of people who use Twitter and who retweeted either something that candidate Trump had said or something that candidate Clinton had said. So you sort of say, well, these are people who are affiliating themselves with one candidate or the other. What did they rely on as their news sources after they had sort of self-identified themselves as a retweeter of one of these candidates? In both columns, in the top 10 sources of news, you would find CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, Politico. On the Trump retweeter side, you would also find very new right digital startups, InfoWars, Breitbart. And on the left, a few new digital sort of ideological startups like Daily Kos and some others. But despite this polarization, the point is, there's still common consumption of all of these legacy mainstream news organizations. It's just a much more fragmented environment. So what happened in 2016? I will wait for your comments, but as our host said, we'll try not to get into any too many wild arguments. I want to, I haven't made a full and careful study of the sort that I would prefer to make of television coverage of the Trump campaign in the 2016 cycle, but I think it's obvious to almost all of us that across newsrooms of all stripes, on the right and on the left, there was an assumption for a very long time that Trump was not a serious candidate, could not win, and so therefore could be enjoyed as entertainment. And if he delivered ratings boosts, then it wasn't too cynical, because after all, he was never going to win the Republican nomination, never mind be elected President of the United States. And I think that complacency was partly a function of the isolation of many news decision makers from the very places, the constituencies where Trump was resonating, and also kind of hollowing out of the news industry in the United States very rapidly over 10 years, where you saw all these newsrooms in Milwaukee and Cleveland and St. Louis you know, shrink very suddenly because newspapers collapsed. And that reporting wasn't placed, that local knowledge wasn't replaced. I mean, as recently as 2000 or 2004, apart from polling or probability of winning, when those newsrooms were healthy and contributing to syndicated wire services and having their local stories picked up even in the Washington Post, the number of stories that would have been flowing out of the counties and states that ended up deciding the election would have been orders of magnitude greater, but also orders of magnitude more sophisticated, more rooted in local understanding of the structure of politics, what was changing, what seemed to be moving around. And we now have in the middle of the country what you might think of as news deserts. You know, investment in journalism has recovered very robustly since the recession, but it's concentrated on the two coasts. It's venture capital investment, it's big digital investment, it's global investment. So it's a great time to come out of our school in New York at 25 with new skills and a new sensibility. There's lots of jobs in Brooklyn, but I remember going into our career fair one Saturday and seeing that there was a desk for Vice, and all of my students were lined up 25 deep. And there was a guy who had come all the way in from the Milwaukee Sentinel-Journal, and he was going to hire an entry-level political reporter to cover Scott Walker in 2015 into 2016. And I literally went up to the students in line and said, will you get out of this line and go over to that desk? I mean, Scott Walker's running for president. You're going to Milwaukee. You're going to have a really formative experience. I could barely convince any of them to do it. Everyone already knew where the excitement was and where the growth was, I thought. Back in the, nothing worse, frankly, than people of our generation saying, back in the day, but since we're all here together, it doesn't feel quite so out of school. But, I've been thinking about what form of pre-election political reporting places like the Post and the Times used to do that's different than what ran up to this election. And I remember coming up, in awe of, intimidated by the great giants of the Post's political reporting staff. That was David Broder and Dan Balls, particularly. And there was Johnny Apple at the Times and others at the Times. They both newspapers would do the same thing in the 2 weeks running up to the vote. They would use their experience and knowledge of historical elections to identify, say, 24 critical counties where it looked like the election was going to be decided and where the Electoral College was rooted. And then they get on planes and they go out to those counties and they would just knock on doors for day after day after day, collecting voices, talking to office holders, talking to local office holders, city councilmen, county executives. And then they would write on the Sunday before the Tuesday, they'd write this big omnibus, sort of portrait of the heartland, portrait of the country on the eve of the vote. And it would be full of voices and some statistics, hardly any polling. And when you got through the piece, you had a sense of what the election was about. You didn't necessarily have a sense of who would win. There might be a little bit of a flavor of, if they thought it was a landslide like Mondale or something, they would kind of tuck that in gently. But generally, they would just say, this is what's going to decide the vote, and this is what the country sounds like on the eve of the election. It's probably about as useful a file as political journalists can create. Now, what happened in 2016? How many of you had your New York Times app on the predictor button on the night of the election? The little kind of graph thing, yeah? Started out, what was the percentage at the beginning of the evening? I think it was 80%. And then it went like, now, this was an election in which there was a bubble of prediction journalism. It was a bubble that was rooted in an important and meaningful change in the use of data and computation to create valid insights about institutions and society. But it was a bubble because with all of this investment on the two coasts, news desert in the middle, news decision makers isolated from the communities, except maybe through family, networks that were really going to decide the election. There became this kind of excitement about trying to predict the outcome. There's a great data journalist and statistician, self-taught, I guess, named Nate Silver. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He's now at an organization called 538. He was at the New York Times for a while. Go, if you're interested in this subject, go Google the 8-part series he just finished on data journalism and the 2016 election. And the last story in particular, which came out today, was a really rounding defense of prediction science and prediction journalism. And he and others in that field have been making that defense very vocally since they came under such fire immediately after the election. But the defense is worth understanding. What it says is, we were not wrong, you just don't understand probability. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on. 538's prediction was 70% probability. And everyone just kind of gathered themselves around that prediction as if it was journalism, as if it was an insight. Yeah. It was a prediction. It was a statement of probability based on an analysis of polls. But he makes the point, and this I think is worth remembering. He says, look, when you as citizens know about probability, and you know what it really means in the world, you actually manage it reasonably well. So for example, if you get up tomorrow morning and you look on your weather forecast, wherever you take it, and it says there's a 70% chance of rain, you take an umbrella out of the closet, you drag it around with you all day, it doesn't rain. When you come home, do you slam the umbrella into the closet and denounce the weatherman? No. You say, oh, he was wrong again. 70% is 70%. That's kind of their defense. Probability is not something that is a source of wide literacy, but even within the media, in newsrooms, it's not. And it will have to become something like that. All right, so here we have this president, calls us enemies of the people, dishonest, has taken rhetorical attacks and incitement, really, against the media as part of his populist strategy, has incited crowds at his rallies to make racist and vile remarks to reporters who are gathered in the pen. His followers will spit at journalists. And then his rhetoric is unceasing, although he has calmed down a little bit with his new chief of staff. So why does this matter? Does it constitute a threat? In what way does it constitute a threat to the First Amendment, to the independent press, to the vision of the press in our constitutional system? I think it does in two ways. So the first is, what is the purpose of this rhetoric? It's political strategy, it's a political tactic, it's speaking to a polarized society and telling one section of a polarized society what it wants to hear. It's an attack on elites. The press are elites, and they're part of a system that has failed in many ways over the last 10 or 20 years. So it's a political and sort of social rhetorical tactic. But it has one consequence, which is that it seeks to delegitimize the professional press in the constitutional system, to weaken it by delegitimizing it at a time when the press is economically weak and fractured across this landscape. Over time, in my experience as an international correspondent working in lots of authoritarian societies, in many conflicts, many small wars, big wars, when the leader of a country incites people to attack a minority, a group, any group, and uses language such as our president has been using, the result is usually violence. And I won't be surprised if we see the kinds of attacks and violence on journalists directly that have started to come up around the edges coverage rallies and where people become angry about the presence of journalism. You cannot use this kind of language and not expect someone to take it up. So that concerns me, because if you look at the position of journalists in other societies, Mexico, Turkey, Egypt, the number of killings is up over the last year or two as this illiberalism, this language has become more acceptable, it's become seen as more of a form of permission. And there are more journalists in jail in Turkey today than work in most mid-sized newsrooms in the country. Now, I think the other threat is to law. One thing that's hard to remember all the time, because our generation, we've grown up in the Watergate period and Pentagon Papers, and we're so accustomed to the Supreme Court jurisprudence that has protected the rights of the press. We don't understand how young that jurisprudence is and how, in some ways, fragile these state shield laws are, because they're essentially politics they're creatures of politics. The Supreme Court jurisprudence about the independence of the press, the rights of the press, really only began in the 1960s with the Sullivan libel case involving the New York Times and the state of Alabama. And Pentagon Papers, which is the case that sharply limits the government's ability to prevent publication, it's 1971. These state shield laws also have grown up very recently. And now, Supreme Court jurisprudence is not something the president directly controls, and there is a strong consensus in defense of the First Amendment in the press, both in Republican-appointed judges and Democratic-appointed judges. I don't see that jurisprudence, shaking or going away anytime soon. But the atmosphere that has been created around fake news, around polarized news, is inevitably going to affect the claims that journalists make when they go into court. Most of these cases are sort of gray area test cases. It's a lot of discretion, and I wouldn't be surprised to see at the state level attempts to undo some of these privileges. And then finally, you have a trend that began under the Obama administration, which was essentially to come close to declaring under the law that the act of a journalist reporting on national security matters, classified matters, the journalist in that reporting is a co-conspirator and is in fact engaged in espionage. It's sort of the criminalization of journalism if you publish national security material. Now, the Obama administration prosecuted more leakers than all previous administrations combined, but even worse, before Attorney General Holder, under pressure from the media in 2014, reversed his stance. He had authorized, or people in his office had authorized, a couple of memos to courts basically saying, if the journalist is knowingly receiving classified information, our case is not only against the leaker for espionage, but also against the journalist for co-conspiracy. Now, this last summer, the Attorney General Sessions announced that the largest number of leak investigations in the Justice Department's history was underway. And he's made plain during his time in the Senate that he does not believe that the press should enjoy any privileges under the First Amendment in terms of Supreme Court jurisprudence, protection of confidential sources, immunity from subpoena, that sort of thing. And he was one of the most significant obstacles to the attempt to pass a shield law at the federal level, because he had an important position in the markup, and he was just unyielding on these issues. So I will not be surprised, none of us should be surprised, if as the outcome of one of these leak investigations, there are also journalists in the mix. This is, after all, what the president urged the FBI director to do. And in fact, they have the cover of bad policy during the Obama administration to kind of pull forward. So these are serious events in the history of our kind of constitutional system. This is not just tweet storms. These are erosions, and they're tied to the erosion of other rights. I think when you look at the place of journalists in other societies, semi-democratic, authoritarian, open but troubled like India. I think one thing you see again and again is that, look, the rights of speech, the rights of assembly, the rights of faith groups, the rights of minorities, the rights of the press, they're not separable from one another. You know, they are intertwined, interconnected. And so when you see the delegitimization or the withdrawal of rights in one area, you can be sure that it's going to be connected to other kinds of changes. So what should we do as I finish here in the press? What's our role? I like what Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, says. You know, we're not at war. We're at work. Our job is to report. We know what our function is. We know what good journalism looks like. What kinds of stories do we work on? We work on stories about the conduct of public officials, conflicts of interest, the role of campaign finance in creating corruption or the appearance of corruption, the agendas of powerful institutions, corporations, individuals, the position of people who are left out of the system, who are marginalized, whether they're victims of deindustrialization and factory close downs in the Midwest, or they're in generational poverty in our cities. Our job is to ask questions about the delivery of government services, why our schools fail, why our medical system fails, to do complex work that isn't easy for other citizens or institutions to get at, to reveal what people don't want revealed. And this is a profession. It's not easy to do this work. And you can see one of the great benefits of what's happened from journalism's perspective over the last 2 years has been this enormous clarification of what it is we're meant to do. And some of us grew up in that world, but I think over the last 10 years in journalism schools, in newsrooms, because of these rapid changes, the collapse of business models, the migration of viewership to social media platforms, polarization in the country, the hostility toward the press, which has always been there, but is worse. That there was a confusion. There was really a loss of confidence in the profession, I think, growing over the last 4 or 5 years. And I feel it restored. I feel, certainly, I look at the file coming out of the major newsrooms of this country, the persistence, the energy, the accountability even, and the work that the Post and the Times are doing, one of the great newspaper wars of the digital age, maybe the last newspaper war where there still are physical newspapers being distributed, even though they're not really the point anymore. And I see a reinvigorated profession at our school, students who turn up suddenly full of purpose that you didn't always detect 2 or 3 years ago. And your behavior, the subscriptions you're buying, the news you're reading, it's a very meaningful set of developments in the last year. But there's one other development that's running in parallel that makes me worried, which is very few of us understand the extent to which pollution has entered into our public square through the social media platforms. We had a lecture at our school the other night where a guy named Craig Silverman, who works for BuzzFeed, came and gave a talk. And he's been one of the earliest and deepest reporters on the manufacture of deliberately false news in small towns in Macedonia for commercial purposes, or the manufacture of highly ideological false news associated with presidential campaigns or propaganda campaigns. And he put some numbers up on the board that shocked even me. The number of deliberately manufactured false stories that are being shared across social media at a time when social media is becoming a dominant, not the only, but a dominant source of news. And it's going to be, and this problem is going to get worse before it gets better, as artificial intelligence allows people in the space to manufacture and stress test their own false news campaigns. And the social media platforms, as you can see, are paralyzed. They don't know how to respond to this. And so the patterns that we saw in 2016, I think are going to return with a vengeance, at least in the next cycle. And neither the news media nor the news-consuming public is prepared to recognize and to evaluate the impact of these campaigns. So I'm excited about getting back to work and seeing the profession do it, but I'm worried about the wall that we are driving toward over the next 4 or 5 years in our public conversation. So thanks for your patience in listening. I appreciate it.
When Trump started making allegations of false news, for a long time I was only aware of the mistake that one journalist made about the removal of a bust from the Oval Office. It had to be a mistake because it was too easy to disprove what he said, and also CNN's screw-ups. But I wonder, were there many others? And if not, then why was the press not challenging Trump to say, enough of saying fake news and there's fake stories, where's the beef? Did they, why weren't they doing that?
Yeah, I think those two examples are very prominent. Sort of reminded a lot of newsrooms that the stakes are very high, which is good for the business because it kind of incents rigor. You make a mistake, you lose your job in a short time. I think a lot of us in the profession are talking about the answer to that question. What is the most effective way for us to build vocal coalitions without getting into a spitting match with the president, who relishes that kind of reality show, exchanges? It's not appropriate for a beat reporter at the Washington Post or even for the Washington Post news file to try to campaign or to push back in that way. But the Columbia Journalism School and the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Society of Professional Journalists, we've got to do more, and we've got to figure out how to be heard, because it's such a noisy environment, and he controls the loudest microphone.
You said it's going to get worse before it gets better. What makes you think it will get better?
Well, I've always admired the American people's ability to kind of rise up and try to fix things. And what's going to have to happen is something that is very difficult, which is that citizens are going to have to learn how to shape a reliable news diet. They're going to have to educate themselves about how to verify and how to evaluate. And this project is sort of like civics. It's a perennial goal. Can't we teach everyone who votes some of the basics about our Constitution, our history, our neighbors? And we fail again and again. We just cannot. And news literacy has been a thing, similarly, for a long time. Well-meaning foundations have invested lots of money in trying to teach high schoolers how to read news and how to evaluate news sources and how to cross-check. But now we're going beyond that. We're going basically how to recognize a hoax, how to recognize something that is very close to being a hoax, and how not to retweet that. And I don't know how many of you, and this is probably not a Twitter demographic, but are some of you on Twitter? Yeah. So you probably noticed during the hurricanes the recurring fake photo of the shark swimming like in a river on a highway. It's like the most obvious hoax photo that you've ever seen. You look at it, you say, "Oh my God, there's a shark swimming up the highway in Houston." Then you say, "Wait a second, the dean of a journalism school, that cannot be true." And then you check it out. Of course, there's ways to do it. You can reverse search the image and immediately get the background. But people so enjoyed retweeting that shark photo that by the time you got to Irma, people were retweeting it going, "Look, I know it's a hoax, but it's so fun." And, But when you get to the kind of vile, defamatory news like around Pizzagate, that horrible campaign about the completely invented idea that there was a pizza parlor in Washington D.C. that was a locus of child sex trafficking associated with the Clinton campaign. I mean, you're talking about something so dark and so vile that it will require citizens to defeat it. A newsroom can't deal with that. Washington Post can write all day long. There's no evidence for this. It's all it's all made up, but it's not going to make things better.
I have two short questions for you about the lead sentence in the front page obituary in the New York Times last November 27th for Fidel Castro. I didn't bring a copy of the obit with me, but I have pretty closely paraphrased the lead sentence. It was pretty closely Fidel Castro, who bedeviled 7 United States presidents, brought the Cold War to the Western Hemisphere in 1959, and briefly brought the world close to the brink of nuclear war. And then there was one other phrase or clause in the lead sentence. Died yesterday at the age of 90. I will say I was not happy with that lead.
I'm really not equipped to answer that question, but I do know that obituary writing is probably not an art that we'll all have to kick around for very long anyway. Anyway, I think your comments are embedded in the question, so I think I'll just let it go there. Sir.
On your final point of social media polarization, you're obviously around a lot of students and younger people. So what do you think are the future implications, since social media and the internet will really be ingrained in this generation, of violent rhetoric, which you described earlier?
Well, I think the big question in front of us that will shape the experiences of the generation that goes to work for these companies or is influenced by them is, what are these companies going to become? Are they going to become are they going to try to preserve the pretense of neutrality which has created this business model? Or are they going to start to curate and edit and become media companies, which I think many of us would say they already are. They're just in denial of the fact that they are media companies. It could go a couple of different ways. I don't see Facebook, they have a chief executive and owner, a founder who has a very set view of what Facebook should and shouldn't be. And I don't see them moving, except under pressure of regulation or the threat of regulation, to change a lot of their practices. But what's interesting to me is, what will Netflix and Amazon and Apple and other very powerful and very well-resourced monopolist Silicon Valley companies do? Will they move into content creation and production? I think there's a lot of sense out there right now that they will. That as this multifaceted competition where you got your phone owned by AT&T that owns Time Warner, and you've got Netflix over here, they're going to be, I think, it's already clear in Netflix's case, they're content creators, content producers. They're already one of the biggest supporters of documentary filmmaking. But will they move all the way into news? And I think that's quite possible. They may do it by buying CNN, or they may try to create their own original version of it. That's the great glory of Vice, was that Vice positioned itself as news for the next generation. And whether you're a big fan or not, it was a beautiful sell. They sold the idea that they were news for the next generation, and the valuation and the cash that they have been paid for positioning themselves in that way is an indication that all these big platforms, they want news. They want news that will reach broad and increasingly younger audiences.
Hi, so as a member of this social media generation, I've noticed a lot of my peers they've been unable to read long articles. They've been focused on these small tidbits of information on Twitter, on Facebook. And I'm really worried that that's going to lead to the death of this journalism, this kind of really high standard that papers like the Times and the Post hold themselves to. And so I was wondering if you think that these institutions are going to adapt to the way that young people are reading news, or if they're going to maintain their integrity but risk dying out in the future.
I think they're trying to balance that walk right now. The real question is, will people pay for quality journalism, and how much will they pay, and what kind of journalism will they pay for? I think the Times, in the financial news business, the question's settled, of course, because the return on reliable news and information is available in the markets and so forth. But in general news, in political news, in the kind of investigative reporting about corruption or conflicts of interest, in the way the advertising market has been disrupted and changed, and looking out so far as one can see into the future with automation and ad exchanges and so forth, news organizations like the Post and the Times are going to have to, and the New Yorker, they're going to have to survive on subscriptions. They're going to have to survive on communities. It does create the challenge of having an emotionally engaged community without surrendering your independence, your standards, and without just feeding people what they want to hear. But subscriptions are working at the Times. The Post says it's making money. I mean, who knows? It's got an owner whose net worth is $20 billion. It's a private company. I don't know what they count, but the vigor of what they're doing is measurable, and the traffic they're attracting is very strong. And there are a few other places that may succeed that way. But part of the reason why the middle of the country is so underserved is because those newspapers, as they went digital and they were late, they weren't able to get their print subscribers to pay in a significant way for digital content, even though they had really valuable news and information about crime in schools and high school sports and lots of other things. If that transition were to occur, if these newsrooms were to, through micropayments or mobile strategies, build meaningful subscription revenue in cities like Milwaukee, then you could see people are going to continue to try. They're going to try that model. They're going to keep working at it because it has a history. There is an appetite for the information. The question is, how do you connect the resources necessary to run a professional newsroom with an audience in that kind of a space? I don't think Facebook is that problem. I think it's up to the news business to come up with these innovations and ways to bring people back to the news that they've always consumed, and in many ways still consume. Last note of the day, evening. So if you go and look at what Americans actually consume by way of news and information, and where are the big numbers, and you look at the aggregate, the total audiences for the three major networks, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, Fox, you're talking about the entire country is consuming quality, strong news, at least as part of their diet. They may be hopping around, they may be mixing up, the Hill with Breitbart, but there is still an enormous demonstrated appetite in this country for news and information that's associated with these legacy brands, fake or not. And that appetite has been disrupted as a business for 10 years, and on the television side it's going to get even more disrupted, but it tells you something that 10, 20, 30 years from now, an educated citizenry and a determined profession can reconnect this role of journalism in our political and public life. That's what I would bet on. So thank you very much.